Welcome to week 11 of Fundamentals of Biblical Interpretation. This is our last week in this class. You will be finishing up reading Dr. Wimberly's Using Scripture in Pastoral Counseling. So I wanted to just say again that the value of using biblical narrative in counseling has to do with the ways that Christians identify with the stories in the Bible and see themselves in those stories. And so the important thing then is to listen and hear which biblical stories the people you're counseling are relating to, and then to use those stories, or guide them is a better way of putting it, guide them to use those stories. And Dr. Wimberly talks about three different things in today's reading. He says that these biblical stories can help people to have more optimism about their own situation. It's really helpful. As we live our lives, we can't see what's around the next corner. And so life can be scary and overwhelming, and we can feel very lost. But when we see ourselves in the biblical narrative, we can see the narrative all laid out, and maybe we can even begin to envision some outcomes that are positive. And so we might have more optimism. One example would be if we see ourselves as the Israelites, sort of wandering through the desert for 40 years. If we can recognize that at the end of their hardship came the land of milk and honey, which, of course, as it turned out, that ended up being a different kind of hardship because there were battles that were awaiting them, but still seeing the positive in the changes in our lives, seeing the positives in the ways that we maybe have one struggle at one period of our lives and a different struggle at a different period. And even maybe recognizing that even when all our dreams come true, there may be some difficulty involved, and it might be a little bit different than what we envisioned. Those kinds of things can be really helpful when we identify with the biblical narrative and when we help people to see what's in those stories that can help them to imagine themselves in a way that is healthy and helpful for them. Another example is Mary and Martha. If we have someone who is identifying with Martha, then maybe thinking about Mary can help the person to imagine himself or herself a little bit differently and begin to work towards that. The second thing that Dr. Wimberly suggests is that seeing ourselves in the biblical narrative and helping the people we're counseling to see themselves in the biblical narrative helps us to see that we're not alone. We see God at work in the Bible, and therefore we can begin to envision God at work in our lives, even when God seems distant or we're not sure what God is doing. We may also find that the biblical narratives give us a structure that allows us to help the people we're counseling to begin to believe in new mythologies that are different from the ones that they were raised with or the ones that they have absorbed as adults that are causing them harm in their life. And we can begin to find new stories and new structures for them through these biblical narratives that they are already seeing themselves in. So I wanted to explain that again and just allow you, as you're reading the stories in this book and the examples that Dr. Wimberly gives, to continue to imagine what using biblical narratives in counseling might look like. Now, Dr. Wimberly mentions a concept on page 116 that I wanted to talk about in a little bit more detail. He says that H. Richard Niebuhr discusses external history and inner history. Now, that's not something I'm very familiar with. I did some very little research on it, but here is where I see it to be particularly useful. Niebuhr suggests that external history is objective. Now, in today's world, we probably would want to qualify that, recognizing that any history that a human being tells is by definition not objective, And so we would want to be a little bit humble and a little bit hesitant about thinking that as human beings we have access to an objective history of the world. But maybe we can think about external history as the big picture, the huge story of history that is going on at the present moment, and that takes into account every single person all across the planet and all of the different trends and changes and currents of behavior and thought and patterns that exist all across the world. We recognize that the Bible has an overarching narrative, and we look at the Bible and we see that God is at work in and through history in these stories that we are told in the Bible. And as people of faith, we believe that God is also at work in and through this external history of the world. Inner history, however, is just my own story, my past, my present, and my future, the way I have experienced it and the way I interpret it. And I think separating these two concepts can be very helpful, because while it's important that we recognize that external history exists and that there are ways that we can participate and influence the greater currents that are going on in our world, we sometimes have a problem when we mix the two up and we maybe begin to see ourselves as fully responsible for these greater trends and the greater story of external history. We really can only be responsible for our own inner history. And it's important to recognize both as we process our own past, our own present, and as we envision our own futures. Now, we can make apologies for our past, we can make restitution for things we've done wrong, but we also have to be able to release our past failures into God's hands, because the greater story that God is writing belongs to God and God's work in the world, and it's not mine to be able to correct or guide in the overarching large-scale picture. It means that we can hope. I can hope every moment that I can play my part as best I can, knowing that my own inner history is only one small part of the great story that God is telling across the world. And so we offer our own integrity, our own love into the world in the ways that we are able to, without taking on the burden of the large external history. And then it also allows us, when we are serving in places that are painful, in places that are disrespectful of us as people, we can serve faithfully. And if we have the opportunity, sometimes we are in places where we don't have the ability to leave. But when we have a choice, it also means we can walk away from painful places of service, knowing that the transformation of that particular community is in God's hands, and it's not my responsibility alone. And so I think these concepts of external history and inner history can be really helpful as we navigate those things. Now, as you're reading the book this week, chapter 6, Dr. Wimberly uses that to situate his approach to counseling within the wider world of hermeneutic approaches to the Bible, as well as secular and religious discussions and disciplines, and also within secular theories of counseling. So that chapter, because I'm not trained as a counselor, was quite a bit beyond me, but those of you in the class who have studied counseling, it will probably make a lot more sense to you, and I look forward to any thoughts or comments that you would like to make on that question. I, however, have chosen a slightly different discussion board question for that chapter, because it's a little bit outside of my area of expertise, quite a bit outside of that area, in fact. So hopefully that question will still be a helpful question, even though it's not directly relevant to that chapter. That's it. Thank you for going with me through these readings and this class, and I look forward to our 2 weekends of work together, and hope that we can learn together from each other through some of the group work that I have planned. Thank you.